Okay, welcome back. This is the LaRouche Pack Lincoln podcast. I'm the host, Mike Stager, and really the special guest and star of the show is Bob Ingram. This is number 7. So if you haven't checked out 1 through 6, I highly encourage you to check these out. The whole hypothesis that this started from was a sense that, one, our nation is in real crisis. And it has been really for decades. But with the presidency of Donald Trump and the revival of the American system of economics, a return to manufacturing, and perhaps most importantly, a return to national sovereignty as a system of sovereign nations, that nations interact with each other as nations, not as alliances or as trading entities or at the behest of global corporations. That the clearest echo of leadership for our nation and for our citizens was Abraham Lincoln. And so we're at that kind of juncture today. So that's the nature of the podcast. So if you haven't checked out 1 through 6, we encourage you to do so. Each one takes up a different theme that kind of develops throughout Lincoln's life. We have a special treat tonight. The last couple have been on Lincoln's economic outlooks, the question of greenbacks, of banking, the American system of economic policy, the development thrust, and really Lincoln's sense of science at the core of a modern industrial nation. This is 150 years ago. Lincoln was putting science at the forefront. And you can see why our nation emerged out of a bloody and devastating civil war to become the greatest economy the world had ever seen. And practically within 100 years, we were landing men and women, men on the moon, and maybe soon women. So tonight we've got a discussion on, as Bob has entitled it, humor, metaphor, and Shakespeare, the kind of unique quality of creative thought of Abraham Lincoln. Before I jump to Bob, just want to remind people, if you have questions or feedback or comments, feel free to send them to podcast@larouchenet.net. So that's podcast@larouchenet.net. We'll get back to either your emails with responses, or we will take up some of your feedback or questions in the subsequent podcasts. So we appreciate the feedback. Bob, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you get this started. This is going to be really interesting, and then we'll take up the discussion.
Okay. All right. Good, Mike. Yeah. So as Mike said, the title of tonight's podcast is Humor, Metaphor, and Shakespeare. So this is going to be a little bit different than what we've done up to this point. It's a little bit more difficult in the sense that what we're dealing with here are really intangibles. We're not just dealing with historical events, bills that were passed by Congress, things that were built, but we're dealing with items which require a little bit more thought as to the subject matter, maybe not, but a different way of looking at it anyway. And the reason I'm doing this is that when you're looking at Lincoln, what you're looking at, putting the policies to one side, is you're looking at profound leadership. And hopefully tonight, by the time we're done here, people will have more insights into who Abraham Lincoln really was. So that said, I'm going to just plunge right into this. And as I said, I think people will find it a little bit different. I'm going to begin by reading you a little story. And I will just, this is not really an apology, but I will tell people that I'm going to be reading quite a bit tonight, and that's not really the best thing to do on one of these podcasts, but that is what is going to happen anyway. So I'll begin by reading you a little story. A gnat came and said to a lion, "I do not in the least fear you, nor are you stronger than I am. For in what does your strength consist? You can scratch with your claws and bite with your teeth. I repeat that I am altogether more powerful than you, and if you doubt it, let us fight and see who will conquer. The gnat, having sounded his horn, fastened himself upon the lion and stung him on the nostrils and on the parts of the face devoid of hair. While trying to crush him, the lion tore himself with his claws until he punished himself severely. The gnat thus prevailed over the lion, and buzzing about in a song of triumph, flew away. But shortly afterwards, he became entangled in the meshes of a cobweb and was eaten by a spider. He greatly lamented his fate, saying, "Woe is me, that I, who can wage war successfully with the king of beasts, should perish myself from this spider, the most inconsiderable of insects." So that's the story. And that is the fable of the gnat and the lion by Aesop. Now, the reason I start with this is that, as we discussed earlier in one of the earlier podcasts about Lincoln and the way in which he educated himself and the way in which he pursued reading, while he was an adolescent, while he was a young man, he read many, many books, including Weems' Life of Washington, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and many, many other books. But when he was very young, when he was a child, and when he was a young adolescent, say a young teenager, the two things he read the most were Aesop and the Bible, particularly the parables in the New Testament. And although some people are not aware of it, there are also parables in the Old Testament. But Lincoln read and reread these fables, these parables, over and over again. He certainly read the story that I just read to you about the gnat and the lion, because he read all of Aesop's fables. What we're going to be discussing tonight is that, as Lincoln grew older, excuse me, as Lincoln grew older, he developed a way of conversing with people, sort of a manner of conversation. And it seems to me, although Lincoln never wrote about this, that it wasn't just a manner of conversation. It really became the way Lincoln thought, a way of thinking. And that way of thinking and that way of conversing was rich in parables, in fables, in metaphor, in stories. And this is really how Lincoln communicated with people. In Illinois, excuse me once again, just need to. In Illinois, Lincoln became, when he was a young man, and this continued through his life, he became famous for his storytelling. He would tell stories in almost every occasion, a social occasion, private conversation. He was extremely well known as a lawyer for telling stories in court, in the course of the trial, while addressing the jury. And sometimes, at the end of the case, where the prosecution and the defense presents their closing argument to the jury, in his closing argument, Lincoln would not even address the facts of the case. Instead, he would tell the jury a story. And this became somewhat, notorious that this was how Lincoln operated. Later on, as in political life, and most certainly when he became president, if anything, this became more pronounced. He would be in a cabinet meeting, talking to, someone about a problem with the blockade of the Confederacy, or about getting food to the soldiers, or about some battle that just occurred, in a cabinet meeting, or talking to a member of Congress, or talking to one of his generals. And Lincoln would say, "This reminds me of a story." And then he would tell a story. There's a scene, I don't know if people who are watching this tonight saw Steven Spielberg's movie on Lincoln from several years ago. I'm not particularly recommending the movie, but there's a scene in that movie where Lincoln is talking to the Secretary of War, Stanton, and Stanton is giving him a report about something. I don't remember the exact details of the movie, but Stanton is giving him a report, and Lincoln interrupts Stanton and says, "That reminds me of a story." And Stanton just freaks out and goes running away saying, "Not another story, not another story." Now, I don't know if that conversation actually took place in real life, but the way in which it's depicted in the movie is true to how Lincoln, to probably many conversations of that type. This is how Lincoln, Lincoln did not communicate so much through facts, through information. He used fables. He used parables to present truthful ideas, to get to a deeper truth, a deeper insight, to get people who he was talking to look at a problem in a different kind of way. And he did this all the time. So that's sort of what we're going to be discussing tonight. And, you could make the argument that this is less important than, say, what we discussed last week on the American system of economics, or the week before on greenbacks and national banking. But again, to repeat what I said at the beginning, we're looking at a crisis, from 1861 to 1865, in which it was by no means certain that the American Republic was going to survive. And when you're looking at Lincoln, you have to look at the deeper qualities of leadership. And I would say this has a great deal of relevance to where we find ourselves today, to the fight that we're in, to summoning up within each of us, within ourselves, qualities of leadership, which are potentially there, but which we may not know exist or may not have ever exercised. And this question of Lincoln and Shakespeare and fables and metaphor, I think is a subject matter which is of great importance as to recognizing the kind of leadership Lincoln had, the kind of person he was. So that said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read to you a series of short pieces. The first two are from the New Testament. The second two are from Aesop. And again, these are without question stories which Lincoln would have read and reread growing up. And then I'm going to read to you some of Lincoln's stories, a few of Lincoln's stories. So from the New Testament, the parable of the lamp on a stand. No one lights a lamp and hides it in a jar or puts it under a bed. Instead, he puts it on a stand so that those who come in can see the light. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Therefore, consider carefully how you listen. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even when he thinks he has, will be taken from him. That's the parable of the lamp on a stand. Then also from the New Testament, the parable of the 10 virgins. The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all of those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, you go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly, I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." So that's the parable of the 10 virgins. Now, I will just say to you that in reading these and reading the next 2, which are from Aesop, I'm not going to try to discuss the meaning of these parables and fables at all. I'm not going to tell you what I think the moral of the story is. I leave it to you, the watcher, the listener, to figure them out for yourselves, because that's what Lincoln had to do. Okay, moving on to Aesop. This is the fable of the flea and the ox. A flea once said to an ox, "How comes it that a big, strong fellow like you is content to serve mankind and do all their hard work for them, while I, who am no bigger than you see, live on their bodies, drink my fill of their blood, and never do a stroke of work for it all?" To which the ox replied, "Men are very kind to me, and so I am grateful to them. They feed and house me well, and every now and then they show their fondness for me by patting me on the head and neck." "They'd pat me too," said the flea, "if I let them, but I take good care they don't, or there would be nothing left of me." So that is the fable of the flea and the ox. And then finally, from Aesop, the fable of the frogs asking for a king. Time was when the frogs were discontented because they had no one to rule over them. So they sent a deputation to Jupiter to ask him to give them a king. Jupiter, despising the folly of their request, cast a log into the pool where they lived and said that that should be their king. The frogs were terrified at first by the splash and scuttled away into the deepest parts of the pool. But by and by, when they saw that the log remained motionless, one by one they ventured to the surface again, and before long, growing bolder, they began to feel such contempt for the log that they even took to sitting upon it. Thinking that a king of that sort was an insult to their dignity, they sent to Jupiter a second time and begged him to take away the sluggish king he had given them and to give them another and a better king. Jupiter, annoyed at being pestered in this way, sent a stork to rule over them, who no sooner arrived among them than he began to catch and eat the frogs as fast as he could. So that's a sort of a curious fable. The fable of the frogs asking for a king. So I'm just going to keep moving along here. And what I'm going to move on to next, as I said, I'm not going to discuss the parables or the fables. I'm going to move on to some of Lincoln's stories. As I said, Lincoln was famous, notorious as a storyteller. He actually developed a reputation for telling bawdy or off-color stories, which unfortunately really didn't survive him, because after he died, many of the people who had known him collected his stories and published them, the stories that they had heard him tell, and which is how we have them today. But what several of them said is that they refused to republish these quote unquote off-color stories because they didn't want to sully Lincoln's reputation. And I think it's really unfortunate that they didn't do so. But there's a couple of things about Lincoln's stories. One is they're funny. They're funny. And obviously, they're intentionally funny. The other thing is that they're never vulgar for the sake of vulgarity. Even some that survive to this day, but even the way people talk about them when in Lincoln's time is there were people who told vulgar jokes. Lincoln didn't do that. Lincoln's humor was always intended to get people to think, using humor to get people to think in a different way about a problem or about something, about an issue. So I'm going to actually read you 3 or 4 of these little stories from Lincoln. And, we'll just see how people like them. The first one is called Revolutionary Dress. Lincoln enjoyed telling a story about a fellow who had a great veneration for Revolutionary War relics. This fellow heard that an old lady had a dress which she had worn in the Revolutionary War. He made a special visit to this lady and asked her if she could produce the dress as a satisfaction to his love of aged things. She obliged him by opening a drawer and bringing out the article in question. The enthusiastic person took up this dress and questioned it. "Were you the dress," said he, "that this lady, once young and blooming, wore at the time of George Washington? No doubt when you came home from the dressmaker, she kissed you as I do now." At this, the relic hunter took the old dress in his hands and kissed it repeatedly. The practical old lady resented such foolishness over an old piece of wearing apparel, and she said, "Stranger, if you want to kiss something old, you had better kiss my ass. It is 16 years older than the dress." So that's Lincoln's story on the revolutionary dress. Next is the story on cider and cake. In Bloomington, Illinois, on September 16th, 1856, Lincoln gave a speech in which he ridiculed Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine. This was the popular sovereignty part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And Lincoln gave a speech ridiculing Stephen Douglas's arguments. And he said, this reminded him of a story of a man who went into a restaurant and called for a ginger cake, which was then handed to him. But spying a sign which said "sweet cider for sale," he handed the cake back to the proprietor and said he would take a glass of cider in its place. After drinking the cider, he started to leave, whereupon the keeper called to him to come back and pay for his cider. The customer replied, "Cider? Why, I gave you the cake for the cider." "Well, then pay me for the cake." "Pay you for the cake? I didn't eat the cake." "Well," replied the keeper, scratching his head, "that is so, but it seems to me I am cheated some way in this deal." Another story. On the occasion when a telegram from Cumberland Gap reached Lincoln this is during the Civil War, a telegram from Cumberland Gap reached Lincoln that firing was heard in the direction of Knoxville, he remarked that he was glad of it. One person who was present, who was thinking about the perils of General Burnside's position at Knoxville uppermost in his mind, could not see why Mr. Lincoln should be glad of a report that there was firing in this location. "Why, you see," responded the president, "it reminds me of a story of Mistress Sally Ward, a neighbor of mine, who had a very large family. Occasionally, one of her numerous progeny would be heard crying out loud in some out-of-the-way place, upon which Mrs. Ward would exclaim, 'There's one of my children that isn't dead yet.'" So that's glad of it. Then there's the story of no deaths in his house. A gentleman was relating to the president how a friend of his had been driven away from New Orleans as a Unionist, and how on his expulsion, when he asked to see the writ by which he was expelled, the deputation which called on him told him that the government would do nothing illegal, so they had issued no illegal writs and simply meant to make him go of his free will. "Well," said Mr. Lincoln, "that reminds me of a story of a hotel keeper down at St. Louis who boasted that he had never had a death in his hotel. For whenever a guest was dying in his house, he carried him out to die in the gutter." And the final story I'll read to you is one that took place at a meeting of the cabinet. And it occurred at a time when it seemed as though war with England and France could not be avoided. Secretary of State Seward and Secretary of War Stanton both were advocating that the United States maintained an attitude, the result of which would have been a declaration of hostilities by Britain and France against the United States. Lincoln asked, why take any more chances than are absolutely necessary? Seward replied, we must maintain our national honor at any cost. Stanton said, we would be branded as cowards before the entire world if we did not stand up to Britain and France. And Lincoln said, this reminds me of a story I heard a day or two ago, the hero of which was on the firing line during a recent battle where the bullets were flying thick. He stayed there, he fought, but finally his courage gave way entirely, and throwing down his gun, he ran for dear life. As he was flying along at top speed, running away from the battle, he came across an officer who drew his revolver and shouted, go back to your regiment at once or I will shoot you. Shoot and be hanged, the soldier exclaimed. What is one bullet compared to a whole hatful? So I mean, I just find these stories very funny. But I'm not going to claim I read them in the best way, but if people were able to follow them, you could see here that there is a great deal of humor, but there is more than just humor. There is more than just getting people to laugh. It's getting people to laugh and at the same time to make light bulbs go off in their minds, to get them to see something in a way that a logical argument, a logical discussion would not have had the same effect, would not have accomplished what needed to be accomplished. And this is really how Lincoln talked. I mean, it is literally the case. A general would come in to see him. A member of the cabinet would come in to see him. A member of Congress would come in to see him. And they would present their argument, and Lincoln would think about it for a minute, and he would say, this reminds me of a story. And then he would proceed to tell a story. And he did this all the time. Now, that's not the way most people have conversations, but it's what Lincoln did. And it's very, very interesting. I find it very, very interesting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move along here to maybe a somewhat more serious subject matter, but one which I think, in my mind at least, is not at all unrelated to what we have discussed up to this point. I mean, some people could say, well, Lincoln read Aesop when he was 12 years old, but that doesn't tell you a lot about what he was like when he was president of the United States. I think it does. But what I'm going to be discussing next is Shakespeare and Lincoln and Shakespeare. And you could say, well, what does Aesop, what do the New Testament parables, what do the humorous stories that Lincoln told throughout his life, what does this have to do with Shakespeare? And I believe it has a lot to do with Shakespeare, you know, and has a lot to do with the way in which Lincoln developed deep insights of thinking, deep insights into all kinds of things, the human condition, human nature, the crisis the nation was in. Anyway, I won't say that much more about it, but I want to preface this discussion about Shakespeare by saying a little bit about Lincoln's upbringing. Because, you know, today, you know, if I don't even know if they read Shakespeare in schools anymore, but, you know, when I went to high school, we did read Shakespeare. And I would imagine, at least in some colleges today, they still read Shakespeare. But it's one thing to be a student sitting in an air-conditioned classroom, you know, reading Shakespeare. But for Lincoln, this has, you know, this has much different context. I mean, first, you know, in particular, I mean, Lincoln saw many Shakespeare performances, but he was particularly drawn to the tragedies, and I'm going to discuss some of those in a few moments. So, what I want to begin to, what I want to preface this with, is just discussing a little bit about Shakespeare's life. When Lincoln was 9 years old, his mother died. He had two siblings, a brother and a sister. His younger brother, his brother died in infancy. I'm not sure of the exactly how old he was, but died in infancy when he was very young. His older sister, Sarah, to whom he was very close, extremely close, died when he was 18, when she was 18. So by 18, his mother was dead, his brother was dead, his sister was dead. When Lincoln was 25, his sweetheart, Anne Rutledge, died of typhoid fever. And her death sent Lincoln, by all accounts, by people who were very close to him, her death sent Lincoln into a deep, deep depression, which lasted for many months. Later, when Lincoln married Mary Todd, they had 4 children, and 3 out of those 4 children died in infancy or young adulthood. Only one of their children lived, you know, into old age. So Lincoln's life is continually, you know, interrupted or, you know, marked by death, by personal tragedy. Now, I'm not trying to, you know, make some psychological profile of Lincoln. These modern biographies, you know, that pretend to, you know, be psychological biographies. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying that Lincoln knew tragedy. See, you know, Lincoln was not someone who just went to college and read Shakespeare. You know, Lincoln led a life in which he repeatedly encountered personal tragedy, personal trials on the deepest level. And then, of course, in 1861, when he becomes president, he's confronted with the greatest tragedy of all, potential tragedy, which is the destruction of the American Republic, the destruction of the nation and of the principles upon which the nation was founded with the Declaration of Independence. And Lincoln is confronted not only with that, but with the knowledge that the responsibility for saving the Republic from that tragedy is on his shoulders, because he is now the president. So I think you have to recognize who Lincoln was and what he was dealing with to really appreciate how he approached Shakespeare and what Shakespeare meant for him. And he actually, at one point when he was president, complained. He wrote a letter in which he complained that that most of the Shakespearean actors who he had seen, were familiar with the parts that they were performing, and some of them were better at their stage presence and were technically better actors, better at emoting than others. But he complained that they didn't fully understand the text of the plays, the meaning of the plays. They had not studied them seriously enough. And he said this in a letter that he wrote during the Civil War. Lincoln was also one other aspect of his character, and I think it is probably almost certainly linked to the tragedies that he himself lived through, was that Lincoln had deep, deep compassion for people. During the war, widows whose sons had been killed in battle would come into the White House and would meet with him. They would ask for an audience, and Lincoln always gave them an audience. Soldiers who had lost their legs or their arms would come into the White House and ask to meet with Lincoln and ask him for a favor. And Lincoln would always meet with them. He had deep feeling for people. That's why I think also why his humor is never mean. It's never mean-spirited. He's never trying to tear someone down. He's trying for the opposite effect. He's trying through his stories, which are really fables and parables. He's trying to help the people he's talking to open their eyes to see something in a different way. On the question of Shakespeare itself, I mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts, but Lincoln was probably introduced to Shakespeare. There's no record that he knew about Shakespeare before this. He was probably introduced to Shakespeare by two people. Shortly after he moved to New Salem, Illinois. This is shortly after he left home and moved to New Salem, Illinois, around 1830. A man named Jack Kelso and another man named Mentor Graham. He took to this immediately. He became, it's one of these, Damascus Road kind of things. He plunged into Shakespeare. Anne Rutledge and he um, spent hours reading Shakespeare together. The as you know, as I said, he was probably introduced to Shakespeare around 1830, maybe 1831. But his secretary, John Hay, reports that by 1833, that is within 2 years or maybe 2.5 years or so, by 1833, that Lincoln was reading Shakespeare more than all other writers together. Now, that's saying a lot because Lincoln read everything. Lincoln was a voracious reader. I mean, last week we discussed Lincoln's interest in science, and we've discussed other things. Lincoln had an unbelievable appetite for learning. But Hay reports that by 1833, Lincoln was reading Shakespeare more than all of his other reading combined. By the 1840s, when Lincoln who's now a lawyer, is what they call riding the circuit in Illinois, which is riding around from town to town where the courts are meeting, hearing cases. And there's groups of lawyers doing this, and even judges. They're all riding around in these little caravans from town to town, to try cases. And while he's riding the circuit, a number of the people who were with him at the time reported that he was never without Shakespeare. And not only was he never without Shakespeare, but that if they stopped for lunch, if they stopped for dinner, when they stopped at night, Lincoln would pull Shakespeare out and he would start reading it. Or if there were people around him, he would read out loud, and he would read to groups of people. And he memorized long passages of Shakespeare and he would recite them. Several people reported that during those years in the 1840s, that among his favorite Shakespearean plays were Macbeth, Hamlet, Richard II, and Richard III, and that he would read these for hours and hours. And if anyone else came into the room, he would immediately start reading out loud to them. As to live Shakespeare performances, it's not clear where or when Lincoln saw his first Shakespearean play. By the late 1830s, there were people doing readings of Shakespeare and performing scenes of Shakespeare in the Lyceum movement, in Illinois and in various towns where there were Lyceum chapters. By 1840 or so, you began to see Shakespearean troupes who began touring, through some of these cities, putting on performances, at least whole scenes or acts, maybe whole plays. But it's very likely that Lincoln at least saw some of these, during that period of time. Now, when Lincoln became president, he attended. I mean, Shakespeare's plays were being performed regularly in the nation's capital, and Lincoln attended these plays as often as he could. I don't know how often, but he went as often as he could. And there's one record that between March 13th, 1863 and November 16th of 1864, so that's about an 18-month period, more or less. And that 18-month period between March of 1863 and November of 1864, that Lincoln attended at least 10 productions of Shakespeare's plays, maybe more. He saw Edwin Booth 7 times, including in Hamlet, Richard III, The Merchant of Venice, The Taming of the Shrew. He saw Edwin Forrest in King Lear. He saw Charlotte Cushman and James Wallack in Macbeth. He saw E.L. Davenport in Hamlet and Othello. He saw James Hackett as Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. And those names that I read to you, except for Edwin Booth, you may not have recognized the names. I mean, why would you? But these people, Edwin Booth, Edwin Forrest, Charlotte Cushman, James Hackett, these were the leading Shakespearean actors and actresses of that era. These were the stars of the Shakespearean stage. And Lincoln saw almost all of these people in various productions of Shakespeare while he was president. Now, Lincoln was actually, there's only one other president, at least up to the time of Lincoln. And, I really never, followed the artistic pursuits of some of our more modern presidents, but it is certainly possible that, both up to the time of Lincoln and perhaps down to the present day, there's only one other president who had such a serious interest in Shakespeare as Abraham Lincoln, and that was George Washington. Washington, actually, when he was president, when the Capitol was in Philadelphia, he staged a full production of Julius Caesar at the presidential residence in Philadelphia. And Washington, in discussions during the war with his general staff, later as president, he not only often quoted Shakespeare, but he had there are reports of numerous lengthy discussions he had with people who were very close to him about Hamlet, about Othello, about The Merchant of Venice, about The Tempest, and about other plays. So, Washington is really the only person up to Lincoln's time who really sees, who has this devotion to Shakespeare in the way that Lincoln did. Now, one of the things that Lincoln did was he developed a correspondence during the Civil War with one of the Shakespearean superstars, James Hackett, who was famous for his portrayals of Falstaff. And I'll just quote you from just a short few lines from one letter that Lincoln wrote to Hackett. He says, "Some of Shakespeare's plays I have never read, while others I have gone over perhaps as frequently as any unprofessional reader. Among the latter are King Lear, Richard III, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and especially Macbeth. I think nothing equals Macbeth. As to Hamlet, unlike you gentlemen of the profession," he's talking to Hackett, "I think the soliloquy in Hamlet commencing, 'Oh, my offense is rank,' surpasses that commencing, 'To be or not to be.'" Now I'm going to just read to you, and I'm going to do a few short readings from Shakespeare, in this section, and I make no claims to be a great reader of Shakespearean drama, but I'll do the best that I can. Lincoln, as I said, refers to the soliloquy, "Oh, my offense is rank." Now, this is the soliloquy delivered by Claudius, who murdered his brother, Hamlet's father, in order to become king. So he murders Hamlet's father in order to become king. And after doing so, Claudius says, "Oh, my offense is rank. It smells to heaven. It hath the primal eldest curse upon it. A brother's murder. Pray, can I not, through inclination, be as sharp as will? Oh, pray, can I not, though inclination, like I said, pray, can I not, though inclination be sharp as will? My stronger guilt defeats my strong intent. And like a man to double business bound, I stand and pause where I shall first begin, and both neglect." Now, Lincoln, and I apologize for butchering the reading, Lincoln considered Claudius's soliloquy to be what he called, and this is a quote, the choicest part of the play. Now, why he said that, and he explains this in his letter to Hackett, and this is a quote from Lincoln. He says, the former soliloquy, that is to be or not to be, is merely a philosophical reflection on the question of life and death, without actual reference to a future judgment. While the latter soliloquy, "Oh, my offense is rank," is a solemn acknowledgement of inevitable punishment hereafter for the infraction of divine law. So you can take that into consideration, and might want to go back and at this point reread Hamlet or think about this. But this is how Lincoln is thinking about it. He's thinking about it and basically saying people aren't looking at this right. They're not looking at it deeply enough. Now, as with his stories, maybe even as time grew on, I don't really know, but as time grew on, maybe even more so than his stories, Lincoln began to read and to recite Shakespeare all the time to people around him. This sort of maybe escalates is not the right word, but this sort of during the Civil War, as the war is deepening, you have to really think about what's going on. The reports are coming in from Antietam, from Shiloh, from here, from there. The casualties are coming into Washington. And Lincoln is reading Shakespeare, studying Shakespeare, and reading and reciting Shakespeare to those around him. Some people know the story, that Lincoln read Shakespeare to his cabinet, to cabinet meetings, people like Seward and Stanton and the other members of the cabinet. Well, that's true, but those aren't the only people he read Shakespeare to. He would be meeting with leaders of Congress, and he'd say, "Let me read to you from Hamlet or from Macbeth." He would go out to visit one of the army camps. Lincoln visited frontline army camps, visited the troops, on the front lines more than any president, any other president in American history. And he would go out there and he would meet with the generals or the colonels. And while they were talking, Lincoln would say, "Let me read to you from Macbeth." And he didn't just do it with the colonels and the generals. There are many reports, firsthand reports, personal reports from people who wrote letters back and everything, where Lincoln would come and visit the troops. and he'd have a big crowd of privates around him and corporals and sergeants. And he'd be laughing with them and joking with them and listening to their stories and listening to their complaints. And then he'd say, okay, boys, how about a little Macbeth? How about a little Hamlet? And then he would either read to them, or often he would recite to them. Sometimes he would do this. I don't know about with the troops, but sometimes he would do this for hours. There's one. It's not a story. It's a true incident. There's one incident where Lincoln had gone down to meet with. This is after the capture of Richmond, and Lincoln had gone down to Richmond to meet with Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, to discuss what they were going to do next. And after meeting with them, he took a boat up the Chesapeake and the Delaware back to Washington, D.C. And the boat ride took several hours. And while he was on the boat, he spent the entire time for hours reciting scenes from Macbeth to people on the boat, people who were with him, who were traveling with him. One of the things he read on the boat during that trip was a scene from Macbeth, a soliloquy by Macbeth following the murder of King Duncan. Now, for those watching this or listening to this who are not familiar with Macbeth, I can't tell you the whole plot of the play, but Macbeth is a fairly noble individual of sorts, who is recruited partially by his wife, partially by his own weaknesses, into a plot to murder the king and seize the throne. One of the things that Lincoln read on this boat ride up the Chesapeake was the soliloquy by Macbeth right after Macbeth murders the king. And in fact, it's reported that he recited this scene, this soliloquy, several times during that boat ride. And I'm just going to read to you an excerpt from it. Begins by Macbeth saying, "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep. The innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast.' Lady Macbeth, what do you mean?" Macbeth, still it cried, "Sleep no more," to all the house. "Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." Now, Glamis and Cawdor are just other names for Macbeth himself. So this is Macbeth, who is now tortured by what he has just done. I'm going to read you one more quote, and then I just want to discuss this a little bit. There was a report that was, I guess, written later by an individual named John Forney, John Forney was the publisher of the Washington Chronicle, newspaper man. And one evening during the Civil War, he visited Lincoln in the White House. This is how Forney described the meeting. He says, "I found Lincoln in a serious mood. He was pale. The dark rings were around his eyes. His hair was brushed back from his temples. And he was reading Shakespeare as I came in. He looked at me and said, 'Let me read you this from Macbeth.' He said, 'I cannot read it like Forrest,' one of the actors. 'I cannot read it like Forrest, but it comes to me tonight like a consolation.'" Lincoln then recited a soliloquy, which is delivered by Macbeth shortly after he learns of the death of his wife, Lady Macbeth. And at a time when not only has Lady Macbeth killed herself, but Macbeth himself is about to be overthrown, is about to face death himself. This is that the attempt to seize the throne, murder the king, has now all come to naught, that it is all collapsing around them into destruction, into death and destruction. And this is the scene that, this is the soliloquy that Macbeth delivers, referring to the death of his wife. "She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty place from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So this is what Lincoln is reading in his study when Forney visits him. And Lincoln then recites it to him. And Lincoln says, "This is what brings me consolation." I would think about that. This is what brings me consolation. If you can trust Forney's account. And look, I would ask people to just stop and think about this a little bit. Some people who are watching this podcast are familiar with the plot, so to speak, of Hamlet, where the uncle murders, Hamlet's uncle murders his brother, the king, and seizes the throne. And then Hamlet utterly fails to deal with that. And there's a lot more involved in the plot, obviously. And then Macbeth, where Macbeth and his wife themselves murder the king. And then as the play develops, they're brought down to utter ruin, utter destruction. Now, think about these not as plays. Think about this not as something you would read in school. Rather, think about the situation that Lincoln was in. Think about what occurred at the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln and others knew many of the people who went over to the Confederacy personally. They were friends with many of these people. As some people know, it's fairly well known, when it was apparent that this was going to lead to armed hostilities, to warfare, Lincoln offered the command of the Union troops to Robert E. Lee through Winfield Scott make the offer to Robert E. Lee. Lee wouldn't do it. There's another man who less well known today named Alexander Stephens. Now, Alexander Stephens became the vice president of the Confederacy, under Jefferson Davis. Alexander Stephens was the vice president. But Lincoln served with Alexander Stephens in Congress in the 1840s for the term that Lincoln was in Congress. And they roomed together. And they ate together. And they actually became friends. I wouldn't call them intimate friends, but they became good friends. They got along. So here are people who you know. For those who know Macbeth, think about it. Think about the characters in Macbeth. The king, Macbeth, the others. Think about the first scene, the first act of Macbeth. And think about what happens to these people. And here you have a situation where people like Robert E. Lee, who as a officer in the Union Army, in the American Army prior to 1860, had sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Here is Alexander Stephens, as a member of Congress, a friend of Lincoln's, who had sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And here they are in 1861, betraying their oaths, acting to murder not a human being, but acting to murder the American Republic. Acting to murder the American Republic in the same way that Macbeth and his wife murder the king. All of this is very real. It's very real. And so I don't see Lincoln reading these plays and simply enjoying them because Shakespeare is such a great writer. There is a much more deeper truths that Lincoln is divining out of these plays, and he is determined to share it with others, drawing them into these readings, these recitals. One thing that Lincoln also pointed to, and I don't think, and he actually did do this. There's one more quote from Shakespeare, from Macbeth, I'm going to read. But Lincoln, one of the things he talks about, and I don't have that quote here, but I did read it. One of the things he talks about is that Macbeth and his wife murder the king. They seize the throne. But what Lincoln says is that it is very clear that from the moment they committed this crime, from the moment they betrayed their oath to the king, that they never experienced any enjoyment from seizing the throne, that they never had a moment where they, they relished or enjoyed the fact that they were now the monarchs. That from the very moment they seized the throne, they were tortured by what they had done, and they were doomed by what they had done. And I would ask you to think about that in terms of Lincoln is looking around. I mean, what was the Confederacy? You could say it was the British attempt to destroy the United States. You could say a lot of things about the Confederacy. But for some of these people, not the real snakes, but for many of these other people, who in the 1850s considered themselves patriotic Americans, what was this for them in terms of the decision they made in 1861, except a betrayal of the most repellent sort, a betrayal, a moral, a patriotic betrayal of their oath of the American Republic, to take what was accomplished in 1776 and to say, we're going to tear that down. We're going to destroy the Republic, all on behalf of slavery. This is what Lincoln is looking at in those years. And the I don't think I will read the final quote from Shakespeare. I've read enough. I have another soliloquy here from Macbeth, but I think I'll just let it go at that. Now, after Lincoln was assassinated, I mean, Lincoln's, I hate to call it love of Shakespeare, but Lincoln's deep involvement with Shakespeare was extremely well known during the Civil War and the closing years of the Civil War. And after his assassination, his body was put on a funeral train, and it was taken back to Illinois. And the route that they took back was not identical, but it was very close to the route that Lincoln had taken to go to Washington in 1861 for his inauguration. He went through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. And along the way, obviously, there were huge crowds of people, and there were all kinds of banners and all kinds of, displays that were put up honoring Lincoln. But what, a lot of people don't know is that amid all of these displays and banners in numerous locations, there were signs and banners and monuments that were put up celebrating Lincoln and Shakespeare. There was a monument. It wasn't a permanent monument, but it was a monument put up along the route in New York City, which had inscriptions and quotes from Hamlet and Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And in New York City, there was a leaflet handed out, which was simply entitled Abraham Lincoln, with a long passage from King John. And that was the text of the leaflet. So, this is, this goes deep. Now, I hope this is people have found this useful. As I said at the beginning, this is a little different and a little difficult, but I'm trying to convey this in the best way that I can, and to ask people to think about this, to think about really, really starting with Aesop and the parables and other things, but the parables, the fables, then Shakespeare, and Lincoln, the way in which Lincoln developed insights and the way in which he communicated with other people to try to elevate them, to elevate how they thought, how they understood things, not simply in an intellectual way, but in a deeper way. And so I guess that's all I'll say about that. Now, in concluding this, and this is going to be brief, there's one other thing I do want to cover, and it's not directly related to what I've covered so far, but I'll never get a chance to cover it in another podcast. So, and I thought this was the appropriate place to do it, which is that another area where Lincoln developed, just became a real enthusiast for as he got older. And this continued and even flourished when he was in the White House, was opera. I mean, he had music in his upbringing. His mother, I don't know about his stepmother, but his mother, Nancy Hanks, used to sing to him all the time when he was a young child, mostly Scottish and Irish folk songs. It's likely that he might have encountered, bits and pieces of opera through the Lyceum movement or elsewhere as a young man. But really, it was after he was elected president that he comes into full acquaintance with opera. The first opera he saw was in New York City while he was on his way to his inauguration. This was well, I don't have the exact date, but it was early in 1861, probably February of 1861. They stopped in New York City, and he saw a performance of Giuseppe Verdi's The Masked Ball. And later that same evening, after he and his wife had gone back to their hotel room, they were actually serenaded by a musical group called the German Quartet of Hoboken, who sang them excerpts from two other Verdi operas, Nabucco and Il Trovatore. But after he got to Washington, he began to attend the opera as often as he could. I don't know all of the operas he saw. I know in 1862, he saw Donizetti's Daughter of the Regiment. In 1864, he and his wife and the Sewards attended Gounod's Faust. Lincoln actually saw Faust several times. In 1865, he saw The Magic Flute. Flotow's opera, Martha, was actually sung in its entirety at the celebration of surrounding Lincoln's second inauguration. And I don't know if a full opera has ever been performed at a presidential administration other than that time. He just became devoted to the opera, to Mozart, to Verdi, to Donizetti, to others. And I just wanted to mention that here because not that it's directly related to what I've been discussing, but simply because, hopefully it will help people, as in the case of Shakespeare, help you to fill out the character of Lincoln more in your mind. I mean, last week we discussed Lincoln and his work with Joseph Henry in the magnetic room, and Lincoln's pursuit of science. And then you look tonight at Lincoln in Shakespeare, Lincoln in opera, which is less important, you could argue, but nevertheless. And to get a sense of the depth of Lincoln's character, a boy who taught himself to read with the help of his stepmother, a boy who educated himself. Now, what I want to close with is I want to read to you 2 paragraphs, and this is taken out of context, but reading the whole speech is too long. So I want to read to you a short quote, 2 paragraphs from Lincoln's first inaugural address. And, I would ask you to think about this, not just in terms of what Lincoln is saying per se, but, from the standpoint of what we've been discussing here, or what I've been trying to discuss, and the way in which Lincoln addresses this. So this is from the first inaugural address, and he says, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy this government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may be strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over the broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Again, not the best reading, but the, when I read this, I tell you, Macbeth just resonates in my mind. It just echoes in my mind in reading this. Lincoln called Macbeth the greatest of the plays. Now, one can argue with that, but you can see why he said that. Profound ideas, but portrayed in a metaphorical way that draws out the truth of them, the power of them, in a way that's inescapable. So that is how I'm going to conclude it tonight. Okay, folks?